Hello, everyone. How you doing? We're here. We are reading Christmas tales. I'll just read the back for you. It's Christmas, and a group of friends have gathered around at the fireside in a remote cottage. As a hushed anticipation falls, only sound is the hiss of logs on the fire, set inside where surely nothing can harm them. Friends begin to tell tales, hear stories of restless spirits eternally condemned to walk the stories haunt you long after you have closed the covers of this good evening from the United Kingdom. Sorry, do you need me to move slightly? Am I still okay? There we are. I'm fine. Okay. The Woodman's Enigma by Gary Kilworth. Thought we'd give us a couple more minutes to give people chance to join us. But I do truly hope you're having the most wonderful evening. It is a Friday night, the last Friday of November, and I thought we would do a little story called The Woodman's Enigma by Gary Kilworth. It was written in 1991, 34 years ago. I was 15 years old. I remember reading it all those years ago, and I still like to read my books of my youth. It's a point horror. Point horror are a big part of my youth, and I've read them all through my teen years. If I'm ever stressed, if I'm ever feeling nostalgic, if I'm ever wanting to go back to being a teenager, point horror is where I will go. I wish that they still did them. We are starting to get a renaissance with point horror with Netflix. Yeah, we are. A lot of R.L. Stein's work is on Netflix now, with the point horror they're doing. And also having the Stranger Things as well. With, I think it's coming back into fashion, hopefully. But if everyone who's going to be here is here, it's very quiet tonight, we'll give it a go. If you're ready, Space Nut, we will start the story. The Woodman's Enigma by Gary Kilworth. They played a game called Enigmas, riddles which they would normally do on their home computer. Since they were on a train, they had to play against each other. One inventing an unusual situation, the other making intelligent guesses as to how that situation came about. The game was a puzzle, often a murder, which the second player had to solve. I've got one, said Colin. Romeo and Juliet are lying dead on the floor in a pool of liquid. They are surrounded by broken glass. What happened? Hello, Digital Voodoo. Good evening. His 10-year-old sister Jill snorted. That's an old one, Colin. Romeo and Juliet are goldfish. The liquid is water, and the bits of glass are their smashed goldfish bowl and a ponytail. Think of a new one, Colin, fair-haired and tall for 13 years of age, sighed and stared out of the window at the falling snow. I can't, not anymore. I've run out of ideas. We really need a computer for a good enigma. I don't expect Uncle Giles to have one. He's 60 something. The train stopped at Basildon Newton, and the pair of them stared out of the window at the brightly lit streets, full of shoppers and excited children. Christmas decorations were everywhere. In the main square was a giant fir tree, covered with coloured lights. They could hear carols being sung over the square speaker system. The train moved on towards Rochford, their destination. In contrast to Basildon, the countryside was around them, black and forbidding, a sparsely populated area of few lights. They were used to streets full of people, noise of the traffic, and the hum of the city. They knew that Rochford was an Essex rural district, and not like at all like their home at Finsbury Park, London. As if that wasn't bad enough, their Uncle Giles lived in a place outside of Rochford, a small village called Ashington, which sounded like the ends of the earth. The train at last pulled into Rochford station. They stepped from the carriage onto the powdery whiteness underfoot and looked around them. It was dark, and the lights along the made a weak show against the night. It was so quiet they could hear themselves walking even though their footsteps were deadened by the snow. 5 o'clock in the evening, and it looks as though everyone's gone to bed, grumbled Colin. Christmas only 7 days away, and here they were in a strange place with no real celebration to look forward to. Both of them felt really miserable, but they knew they had to make the best of an unfortunate time. Is that Uncle Giles? Said Jill, pointing to a man in a heavy overcoat just near the station exit. I don't know, replied her brother, gripping their suitcase. We'd better go and ask. By the time they had reached the exit, however, the person had gone. They passed through the thicket barrier and found themselves on the road, which sloped down to the town below. Everywhere was soft with new snow. There was no car waiting outside. In fact, the area looked quite deserted. Colin felt responsible for his younger sister, though in truth he knew she was just as capable as he was in an emergency. I'd better phone the cottage. It may have got the times of the trains wrong and still be at home, said Colin. You look after the suitcase, Jill. He found some coins in his pocket and went to the telephone booth near the taxi stand. Their mother had written their Uncle Giles' number on a slip of paper, and Colin dialed it, only to find that the phone at the other end rang several times without being answered. Just as he left the booth, a taxi arrived. The driver took out a newspaper and began to read it by the light from the courtesy lamp above his rear view mirror. Colin studied the man's face for a few moments before walking across to the vehicle. The driver wound down his window and Colin spoke to it. Excuse me, could you tell me how much it costs to go to Kate's cottage in Ashington, Giles Foster's place? £3. The taxi driver looked at Colin quizzically. You want to go there? Colin shivered, looked at the dark, then made a sudden. There were still fluffs of snow in the air, and it was getting colder. There were ice beards on the window sills of the houses. He decided it was best that the two of them got to the cottage as soon as possible. Out in the country, the wind seemed harder and sharper than it did in London. Yes, please, he told the driver. Meet my sister's over there. I'll call her. Jill, come on. We're taking a taxi. They drove out of the town towards the nearby village of Ashington, leaving most of the houses and lights behind. Colin caught the last glimpse of a family crowded around their television set, the colours flickering behind the glass panes. And then the road disappeared into blackness. They could have been anywhere, in the middle of the forest, a desert, a marshland. The headlights of the car only picked out the roots of car wheels in the and the occasional whitened hedgerow. The taxi driver asked them if they had expected to be met by someone at the station. Yes, yes, we were. Our Uncle Giles would have got the times of the trains wrong, said Jill. He should have been there. Wasn't. Colin saw the taxi driver frown in the rear view mirror. That doesn't sound like Giles Foster, he said. Your uncle and me go way back, and I've always found him punctual. Colin shrugged. Anybody can mistake, I suppose, he said. We've never actually met Uncle Giles, not so's we can remember. Our mum's sick in hospital. She's got to have an operation, so she had someone call Uncle Giles, and he said he would take us for Christmas. What about your dad? Asked the driver, peering out into the blackness as they wound. The snow had started falling heavily again now, and large white flakes were flying into the windscreen, some sticking there. The wipers were having to work hard to keep the driver's vision clear. Dad's not with us, answered Colin, reluctant to let this stranger into his family affairs. The car suddenly pulled off the main road and went jolting along what must have been a mud track, through some stout trees which jumped out of the headlights. Tangled thickets narrowed the width of the track the further they went in, and a feeling of apprehension went through Colin. He suddenly had the chilling thought that maybe the taxi driver was kidnapping them. and realized how foolish he had been to just jump into the car without checking with the station staff first. Maybe he thought their dad was rich and would pay a lot of money to get them back again. Where are we going? Colin said sharply. The driver did not seem put out by his tone, but sounded surprised. Chase Cottage. That was where you asked for, wasn't it? Here it is now. They pulled up outside a wooden shiplap cottage, and Colin let out a little sigh of relief. In the headlights, he could see that it was a shambling one-story dwelling with some rooms in the roof. At least there were windows up there, and he assumed these were bedrooms. All around the cottage and at the back, there were sinister-looking crooked trees. Blackthorns, thought Colin, remembering the word from his uncle's letter to his mother. There was only a faint glow of light. He was anxious to get indoors now, out of the cold, out of the night. The driver took the suitcase from the boot of the car and propped it against the picket fence. And Colin held out 3 coins for him to take. The man said, "No, I'll sort that out with Giles in a minute. I want to make sure he's home first. It don't much look like it." Just then, a call came over the taxi's radio, and the driver found he was being asked to pick up an urgent fare from another location. "Look," he said, "if your uncle's not there, you'll find the key under the mat. Go in and get warm. I'll come back later to make sure you're all right." "Thank you," said Jill, and gave him one of her famous smiles that showed most of her gums as well as her teeth. "Yeah, thanks," said Colin, feeling a little guilty now that he had misjudged her, though he knew it was always best to be wary of strangers, whoever they were. The car drove away, its headlights in a horizontal arc, as the driver did a complete turn, leaving them with the cottage. Once the lights had gone, the place looked very gloomy and very pretty. Still, there was that glow from inside the held a promise, if nothing else. Jill began to drag the case down the scaffold, saying, "I can manage, I can manage," and Colin protested. "You can manage," rumbled Colin, breath coming out in ghostly plumes. "But will we have any suitcase left when you get there?" Still, he knew better than to argue with his sister, who was sharper witted than him in many ways. And he ran forward and tried the. It was indeed locked. There was a lion's head iron knocker on the door. It was ice cold to the touch and stiff. But he hammered with this for at least till the sound echoed through the cottage. No one answered. Finally, Bill found the doormat under the sofa and lifted it. Underneath there was the rusty key, as well as the corpses of a few summer bugs. "You can have the dead bodies," he said, "and I'll have the key. Thanks very much, sis, Colin said sarcastically, and was faintly pleased when she couldn't turn the key in the lock and had to let him try. Unfortunately, it didn't work for Colin either. The lock had frozen, and they had to take turns to puff warm air into it for a few moments before the mechanism touched. Finally, they got the door open and pulled the heavy suitcase in. It felt warm inside, as though someone had not long left the room. Colin pulled off his woolen gloves. Hello, Uncle Giles, Colin called. No answer. Strange smells hit Colin's nostrils of musty furniture and old person carpets and curtains. Great Uncle Giles was a bachelor. Their mother had warned them that the place might not be entirely wholesome. Still, in the dim light, his room looked withered. The glow they had seen through the window was in the living room. Jill tried the light switch, but nothing happened. Just now, look, she said. A power cut or something. Doesn't matter, Colin replied. We'll just have to wait until it comes back on. Even if Uncle has got a home computer, it won't work without electricity. Might have a gas one, said Jill jokingly. Colin looked around the living room, his eyes becoming used to the dim light of the fire. What he saw did not encourage any hope of his uncle owning a computer. Old dusty books lined two of the walls, and a sepia photograph of young men sitting in chairs under a palm tree hung on the third. The table, writing bureau, Welsh dresser, dark brown, gleamed with an ancient old person's furniture. The carpet looked as if it had come from the floor of an Indian takeaway. Even the television looked as if it had been thrown away before Colin was born, and someone had fished it off the junk heap and got it working again. I very much doubt it, though, sis. Even a steam-driven one by the looks of it. We'll have to forget our plan for a while. The plan was that they invented a new video game in order to make themselves enough money to get their father home. Dad was in Saudi Arabia, working for a petroleum company. He had been unable to find work in England and wanted to make his fortune out in the Middle East so that he could open a bicycle shop. The plan was not really a pipe dream. Colin and Jill were indeed whiz kids when it came to home computers and had been playing video games since they was just another step to inventing one themselves. A 16-year-old friend of theirs had set up a workshop in his garage and was well on his way to producing his third video game for sale in the shops. Though they had sold reasonably well due to lack of competition, his games so far had been pretty mediocre. He was a businessman, not an inventor. His ideas lacked the flair and imagination that he knew Jill and Colin could give the game. If Jill and Colin could come up with a really good one, he had told them, you could make a fortune between them. You invent the game and I'll produce and market it, the boy had told them. We'll split the profits 3 ways. So the two of them had to come up with a brilliant idea. That would be difficult without a home computer. Something shifted in the grate, and Jill jumped. What was that? She whispered. Colin stared at her face, shining in the dying light, and knew she would hate it if they were left in darkness. It was a weird house. The silence was broken by the creaks and groans of the timber-framed cottage, and the whistling of the wind around the chimney pot. From the mantelpiece came the slow tick-tock of a clock shaped like Napoleon's hat. It's nothing, he told her. Logs in the fire just moved. Why? A sensible question from Jill. Well, I dunno. Because there's burning away, I suppose. They're going to go out soon, if we don't get lost, said Jill. There don't seem to be any in the fire. You go and have a look in the kitchen. Maybe you'll find a torch in there. Colin went to an open doorway leading off the living room, stared into a solid wall of blackness beyond. Is this the kitchen? He asked after a while. Jill retorted, how would I know? Go in and find out. You go in and find out. What am I supposed to do? Feel around the floor? He left the doorway and went back to the fire. Where on earth's Uncle Giles got? You think something's happened to him? Maybe he had a crash in his car, ran off the road in the bad weather or something. There's nothing we can do. We'll just have to wait until he comes home. Or the taxi driver comes back. Could phone the police, said Colin. Let's wait a bit longer, suggested Jill. We've only been here a little. One of us could go outside and look for some wood and see a bit better out of the doors. Stay here then, said Colin, going to the front door. The clock chimed once on the half hour, and Jill was visibly startled. No way, she replied, coming up behind him fast. I'm not staying in this spooky place of my own. I think the furniture is alive. If we watch that dresser for long enough, it starts to move forward. Imagination, Colin said. It doesn't matter what it is, I don't like it. So they both went outside, where it was indeed a little light had been indoors. A bitterly cold wind cut around the corner of the cottage. There were icicle fringes around the gutters, glittered in the starlight. Every so often, a patch of snow from the roof slithered to the ground. They went around the house once, looking for a wood store, but failed to find anything. Let's try the trees around the side. Maybe we can find some broken branches or something. The now deep snow softened their foot, went into the spinney, and began looking around for lumps in the whiteness. Most of the trees were blackthorns, which not only got in their way, but were too skinny to be of any use on the fire. Then they came to a massive evergreen tree, whose boughs were weighted down with snow, so that some of them touched the ground. The snow had been too heavy for one old dead branch, and snapped away under the strain, and had fallen to the earth where it had made the branch-shaped hole. "Help me carry this to the house," said Colin softly. "Okay," said Jill very quietly. "But why are we whispering like this?" It was true. He had started the It was a reaction to the blackthorn thicket and the tangled briars that joined them together, almost as if they were making a net to trap very travellers. There was no real reason for such a feeling. All he knew was that he felt very easy, as if someone were watching us by, noting their activities. He stared into the knitted shapes created by the blackthorns. But though he saw many different kinds of darkness there, he could make out no definite forms. It was simply a network of shades and shadows under the starlight. A fox coughed into the night from somewhere nearby. Colin almost turned and ran. "I don't like this place much," he muttered, gritting his teeth. Jill said, "Does. Come on, let's get this branch on the fire." Once they had the bough back at the house, they realised they would have to break it in half to get it on the fire. So Colin fat end in the gap between the gate and its post and pushed on it until it snapped and sent him flying forward. He jumped to his feet quickly and looked around him, half expecting a laugh to come out of the darkness. There was still that sensation that he was being followed. "Stop messing about," said Jill. "I'm not." "Oh, never mind." He didn't want to tell her he was jittery, because that would make her scared too, and he could only just handle himself at the moment. Besides, although he felt so about his surroundings, he hated to look a fool. They took the two halves of the branch back into the cottage and luckily managed to put it on the fire. The logs immediately began spurting coloured gases, which burned green and blue. There was an instant flare, which helped to brighten the room. Shadows danced around the whitewashed, leaping out from some solid objects and slipping under others. The only trouble was that the logs started to crackle, sending smouldering bits flying into the stone fireplace. Colin realised they would have to watch the fire closely in case one of the glowing bits reached the carpet. It wouldn't do to burn down Uncle Giles's cottage for him. The next thought that occurred to him was that they ought to secure the place properly. If they had been followed from the they needed to lock the front door. He found a bolt and shot it home. Once they were locked inside, he felt, though there was still that eerie atmosphere in the room, sort of anticipation, as if the cottage were expecting someone to visit. Colin found himself looking over his shoulder at the door while he warmed his hands by the fire. Jill left the fire and began inspecting the room. She came across a large carved wooden chest, undoubtedly from the same Indian takeaway as the carpet. She tapped it with her foot. I read a story once, she said, where a girl got locked in a chest playing hide and seek. They never found her, and they didn't lift the lid for 100 years. When someone did, there was nothing but a skeleton inside, all crouched. You're a cheerful sort, grumbled Colin. Jill said, why don't we open it and look inside? Colin knew that Jill was testing him. He marched over to the trunk, and before she could stop him, he threw back the lid. They both had time before sneaking up inside, only to see with some relief that it was full of blankets. Satisfied? He asked. I knew it was blanket time, said Jill. They went and sat by the fire. A short while later, silence was broken by a sharp rat-a-tat-tat on the front door. Someone was tapping with the knocker, though not at all firmly. It was almost as if the caller felt he might be disturbing the occupants by knocking at all. Colin looked into his sister's eyes. Shall we answer it? He whispered, having a reason now to keep his voice low. He received a wide-eyed look and a shrug of the shoulders. Colin bit his lip and remained still. The knock came again, this time even more gently, and a voice cried, let me in! Let me in! I know you're in there. Where of you? You bolted me out. It sounded like a man with a country dialect. Are you? Cried Jill, her voice quivering. The reply was muffled, as if the person outside was swathed in a scarf, or had their head deep down in their coat. Giles Foster! Colin let out a breath of relief. Uncle Giles, he said, and unbolted. Moments later, a tall, thin gentleman stood before them, his eyes red and rheumy, and his face pale. It's bitter cold out there, he said, loosening the long scarf around his neck a little. He didn't talk, but removed a black hat from his head. Sharp, sharp as a woodman's axe. I hate the winter when it cuts into my bones like this. You, he pointed at Colin, and you, the long finger was directed at Jill. You're children. You don't feel the cold, not like us older. Shut the door again, will you? Colin did as he was told, ramming the huge bolt into its slot. Giles Foster went immediately and sat in the oak stuffed armchair at its side. I'll keep my coat on for a while, he said, until I've warmed through. I'm chilled to the marrow. Not much meat there to keep out the winds these days. And indeed he did look thin and haggard, brawny neck disappearing down into the rolls of the woolen scarf. His cheeks were hollow and pinched, and the bones stuck out like points just below the outer corners of his red ribbed eyes. There was a weary look to him, as if he were attempting to conquer some wasting illness and losing the fight. Give me your hand, girl, he ordered, and grasped her palm. And yours too, boy. The thin fingers were like frozen marble. Jill pulled away sharply, but to cover her bad manners, remarked. You are old. People, replied Giles, of my age, pick worse than children. I once thought I shouldn't mind being old, that it would be quite comfortable. But it won't be, I'm sure. It'll be damned uncomfortable, especially in weather like this. Now, where was we? He let go of Colin's fingers and stared into the fire, rubbing his hands together with a pebbly sound. He looked intently at the hissing logs, one of which was burning quite strongly now, seemed to lose himself in thought. Colin said, "We had to take a taxi to Oxford Station. Weren't there to meet us, Uncle. Taxi man said he'd come back to sort things out with you." Ah, did he now? Did he now? Yes, yes. I were at Hockley railway station myself. Ashenden village is a it's in between the two stations, you see. And I expected you at that one. Never mind, you're here now. And no harm done. His eyes shone brightly from the depths of his narrow face as he peered at the children. No harm done. You had no bad encounters, I trust. Encounters? Asked Jill. Giles turned his head quickly. Yes, the ghost. Colin swallowed hard, and his toes suddenly developed pins and needles, almost without thinking, because he really didn't want to know. He asked, "What ghost?" Giles studied him first, then, "Of course," he said at length, "you won't know about our ghost. I don't suppose nobody told you, has they?" "Well, we have one. That's a common known fact. He haunts the spinney mostly. He sometimes comes in here, looking." "Who?" said Jill excitedly. "Who's he looking for?" "Not for nobody in particular. For a way to leave this earth, that's what for." Colin tried to change the subject, not because phantoms and spooks worried him, because he only half believed in such things, but because it seemed to excite their uncle. Charles's face became feverishly animated when he was speaking. It was almost as if the word "ghost" imagination. His eyes became too bright. His lips quivered. His expression was more frightening than what he was actually saying. "The lights have gone," Colin said, in order to change the subject. "Maybe it's news or something." Giles stared at him for a moment in the firelight, remarked, "Light?" and then pointed to the house dresser. "There's some candlesticks in there, lad, on the shelf under the plates. Bring them here." Colin went to the dresser, and sure enough, there were two half-burned candles lying on a shelf. He brought them to the fire and lit them on one of the logs. He then placed the two lighted sticks, one either end of the mantelpiece, in the ornate brass candle holders that were fixed on brackets to the wall. The added light made the room a little more comfortable. When he took a look at the expression on his sister's face, Colin realized the talk of apparition. Jill was fascinated by ghosts, even though she claimed there were no such thing. We didn't see any ghosts when we were in the spinney, said to Giles. He looked at them quickly. You was in the spinney? What? An ice spinney? You went out there in the dark? Were you afraid? No, said Jill, sitting on the mat before the blazing logs, hugging her knees. We don't believe in ghosts. Don't believe in ghosts? Snapped Giles, and for a minute he looked quite angry. I Colin, and he almost put his arm around his sister to protect her. Then Giles shook his head slowly. A sad expression gradually replaced the stern look. Suddenly, the logs on the fire spat a shower of smoke into the fireplace. Giles, straight, pointed. What's that? He cried. What? Asked Colin nervously. Them logs. Where did they come from? Jill got them from under that big tree. Minnie, what's the matter, Uncle? The big tree in the spinney, repeated Giles, still staring into the flames of the spitting logs. The old yew tree. He looked at his red-rimmed eyes. No wonder. Silence. Then he continued. Yews is ancient trees. It holds all the secrets. They can more than 1,000 years greeners. That one's only half such an age. Still and all, he played with the buttercups. You'll meet the ghost. Much is certain. Both children glanced nervously towards the despite their conviction that spectres were simply inventions of an over-imaginative mind. Why do you say that, Colin? There's no such thing as ghosts. Really, there isn't. You spoke on that one already, replied the using the poker for the logs, and getting another shower of sparks. Them what repeat things really don't mean what they say. They mean the opposite. Let me speak more on this ghost, and then you can make up your own Giles got once, and then told the tale. The years was a fiddling a bit, working around to finish off the century. There was this woodman, a fine figure, he cut trees like some folks cut butter. But it's time to lay aside his axe and go a courting, settle a bit. He'd been compassing, pollarding down trees all his life. Had reached an age when his muscles and bones complained in bed at night. Harvesting and pollarding, well, they're special ways of trimming trees so that they send out more growth. All sorts of approach. But the cutting down of trees, that's a different story. Old Giles' cheeks grew waxy in the firelight. As he talked and his eyes had a faraway look. In them days, they didn't much in the ways of reply. And the woodmen over the centuries had all destroyed the forest, leaving only a copse or two, maybe two or three. Some say the old yew tree killed him on purpose while he were on his way to the church. Killed him on purpose, repeated Jill. You mean the yew tree attacked him? Nothing so theatrical as that, sorry to report. There he were, all dressed up in his best togs, and he walked under the old yew tree. He were on his way to a carol service 2 days before Christmas. He never arrived at the carols, though several folks was expecting. So once all the singing were done, they went out to look for him. They didn't need to go far. He were under. He were close by, hanging by the neck. Somebody walked under the old yew, caught a clip on his ear from a dangling boot. When he looked up, there were the woodman, gripped by the throat, in the foreground, swinging backward and forward as easy as a dead rabbit on a string. Since that time he's been wandering the city, haunting the place, haunting the Bone Chase cottage, making a nuisance of himself every time he burns a piece of the yew. That's why, Colin cried. That's why he's tonight, because we burned a branch of yew. That's the reason, said Jack. People don't do it that often, you see. Being a yew, the yew don't burn so well. It spits the sparks, and those who know about kindling and firewood never use yew in their grates. It's the woodman's only chance to send his spirit to rest. Why? Asked Jill. Why is it his only chance? Giles stared into the flame. What is it? Asked Jill. Point green finger. I do believe that it might be the very branch that strangled the though of course I can't be sure. It has a weasel on a fence he were. I do to roam that were what left it for his kid with his axe. There were no going straight to heaven, of course, because the woodsman was not in particular religious. The way of his death were very mysterious, as you can see, until someone living guesses exactly how the woodman met his death. Spirit is not to be put to rest. In those days, people knew about God, and when he started appearing before the owners of the cottage, there were much thought put to the question of death. But the best brains in the village came up with ideas of suicide and murder, but failed to reach the right. These days, no one cares anymore and wouldn't know what to do if they did. Terrible story, said Jill, sitting down at the old man's feet. So the woodman has to keep coming back as a ghost until someone guesses how he was killed. Come on, Colin. We can think of how he died the way we play enigmas. Colin didn't feel much like playing games, but sighed in agreement. Giles nodded slowly, but added, I feel I have to warn you that if you fail to get the answer right, there is a penalty. What? Asked Colin, his skin tingling. The woodsman's ghost will return night after night, harass you until you're half out of your mind with fear. And when you think you can't be scared no more, he'll strike your soul with terror. You'll wake up in the morning dreading the coming of the dark. The children could see that their uncle was deadly. This had become more than a game. But there was a compulsion to go on. Neither of them missed, even though they were more scared than they had ever been in their lives before. Jill swallowed hard and said, "The wind sweep the branch down low and scoop him up." "Doubtful," said Colin, seeing the disapproval on his uncle's features. "It would have to be a pretty strong wind." "Can we ask you questions, uncle?" "You can try," replied Giles. "Right. Now, did the woodman climb the tree?" "Yes, he climbed the tree." "And split!" cried Jill. "Possible," replied Giles. "But why did he climb the tree in the first?" Colin considered this. He and Jill were used to playing enigma games, and their hope it was just a matter of getting rid of the impossible, to come up with a probable. "It was Christmas," muttered Colin, "and the yew is an evergreen. I know that." He was climbing up to get fur coat. Giles shook his head in contempt. "Although the yew is an evergreen, it bears scarlet berries, not cones. You know very little about trees, boy. You learn nothing in life." Jill, who loved elaborate wild guesses, there was a kite caught in the branch, and the woodman wanted to take it home to his grandchildren, so he climbed up to get it. "Wrong again. The woodmen were a bachelor," Colin muttered thoughtfully. "An old